Okay, in this part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about the work of Pierre Bourdieu and do a kind of broad outline of his ideas. So by the end of the course, you'll be able to tell very much that Bourdieu is my kind of key theorist in my own work and is really influential on the way that I do sociology, particularly in terms of both method and the theoretical way that I analyse stuff. He is one of the most cited and most influential sociologists ever, really, but particularly in the latter part of the 20th century and certainly in the last couple of decades. So I think he's constantly cited and having as much influence as ever before. So he's very influential in a positive sense, but also, there's a whole bunch of sociologists that criticise him and that kind of stuff. Some of the criticism being really fair. So, like all the kind of huge name sociologists, there's a whole industry around them in terms of critically engaging with their work or developing their ideas in ways to kind of keep up with social change and that kind of thing. Throughout this part, I'm going to kind of go through the kind of different concepts that he used that all kind of hold together as a particular way of doing sociology and a particular way of thinking about the world. So it's important to kind of point out at the start that there's limits to this. Bourdieu can't really be used to analyse everything. I suppose Bourdieu is particularly useful for thinking about hierarchies, for thinking about inequalities, but also for thinking about the different ways that we relate to each other and how we make judgments about other and how that means, and how those judgments kind of also mean the way that we categorise ourselves. And all these things have an influence on what Bourdieu calls practice, that is the way that we live our life, and I suppose in relation to the reflexive modernity theorists, on the way that we make choices and the way that we kind of, try and construct that narrative of the self, within these kind of various structural limits. So they're heuristic devices, these things. They're meant to be used for thinking with and through. They're not like a sociological law, and the theories aren't just theories themselves. They were developed through, decades and decades of empirical work. But importantly, these theories are kind of, particularly the habitus, field and capital triad, are meant to kind of set up a methodology, a way of kind of doing research in and of itself. I'm going to start with some of the other kind of less famous concepts though, because I think they're often overlooked, and the reason and the fact that they're overlooked actually means to me that some of the criticisms of Bourdieu don't make a lot of sense. So that's kind of why I'm doing that. These kind of concepts too are multi-scalar and scalable, so we can use them at different levels, of the micro, the meso, and the different levels of society. We can do it, think about kind of broad institutional things with using field, or kind of focusing more on capitals and habitus to think about the way the individuals work. So they're kind of quite flexible in that sense as well. So importantly, to begin with, you need to kind of consider the way what Bourdieu's kind of focus of study was, and what he kind of, I suppose, the model of the human being that he's using in to do this research, because it kind of influences the rest of the way that the concepts work. So, like in Marx's work, people are kind of producers. The way that we think about them is kind of the work that they do or their relationship to the means of production, and Weber kind of pointed out there's more status and market situations involved. So while, Bourdieu kind of uses those kind of Marx and Weber-esque kind of models to kind of think about people aren't just workers and aren't just consumers, they're kind of symbolizers. We move around the world kind of, signaling who we want to be, but also making judgments and categorizing other people through the kind of ways that they're dressed and the things they like and things like that. So the construction of social reality in this sense consists of what Bourdieu calls struggles, and Bourdieu studies themselves in the different fields, such as consumption or politics or photography or whatever, are essentially the analysis of struggles, the way that different people taking up that practice or operating in that institution are doing, things, trying to kind of get things done, to create or do whatever really. But there's different ways of doing things, but there's a dominant way of doing things that some people find more easy to kind of access, and there's kind of dominated people within those fields that are struggling to keep up or struggling to get access or struggling to change the field more towards their own interests. So these are the kind of things that Bourdieu is interested in. So, for instance, the struggle in politics would be kind of, if I want to be oversimplistic here, the left versus the right, where the left may want to kind of redistribute wealth, where the right wants to kind of, rely on the trickle-down effect. There's therefore then struggles on over, that politics in relation to that economics. And that's kind of, a struggle over knowledge, but is also therefore a struggle over the power and the way that the field works. In terms of the model of what it means to being a human, Bourdieu talks about how who we are is the accumulation of our being. Essentially, who we are is the accumulation of our experiences, and we're socialized in a particular way to kind of have a particular, I suppose, orientation towards the world. So, very broadly here, socialization is important. If you've studied any sociology already, to kind of think about, things like inequalities and genders and, nature versus nurture and all that kind of stuff. What Bourdieu is saying here, though, is what we do is build up a kind of reservoir of experiences, and they become a kind of socialized memory for us, and that's the things that we then draw upon to make decisions and to face the future. So we're all struggling to accumulate our being in various ways. So, you go to university, you would accumulate kind of educational qualifications, and I don't know, you might collect records or something to accumulate kind of knowledge about that, and all these different practices that we do, Bourdieu points out it's a kind of accumulation effect, and we're kind of struggling over the kind of resources in those fields. Struggle does imply that it's kind of a negative effect, but like some struggles are fun, like so, being involved in sports and stuff like that, and competing over whatever, it can be fun and all that kind of thing, but others are much more serious. And so again, that's kind of the multi-scalar thing that I'm talking about there. The metaphor of struggle here can be used to think about, who lives and dies, but also can be then thought about, who's more likely to, rise to the top of tennis or something like that. So, another way important to think about this in terms of what Bourdieu talks about in terms of his version of the human is that the way that we kind of, are kind of thrown into the world when we're born. So you can see here there's some kind of concession towards existential theory, that like if we were just kind of thrown in the world without any meaning, that would be kind of, horrible. We would be kind of in all kinds of trouble if that was the case. But what humans have done since, they started was to invent meanings, religion being a particular one. But increasingly today there's all kinds of different ways of living, and different things that we invest our lives into. If we don't have things to invest our lives into, if we don't kind of have some kind of meaning to invest into, our lives would be unlivable. They wouldn't make a lot of sense. So while that can be in some ways quite ideological, Bourdieu sees this as a necessity, that we need these things. He uses then this idea of social gravity, a kind of gravity here with two different meanings. The seriousness that like we need to invest in things to, give our life meaning, and the more that we invest ourselves in something, the more serious it becomes. But also gravity in the sense of that magnetic kind of thing, that we're kind of pushed and pulled by forces beyond our control, meaning that we invest in some things and not others, and often we don't have full control over that. A really important concept that's often overlooked in Bourdieu is the notion of Illusio. So again, it's not false consciousness, it's this idea of investment. Illusio means that as individuals we'll kind of go into a particular field and we'll invest ourselves in it. Some of us will do it better than others based on the capitals that we have. But this is the kind of reasons why we do things, I suppose, the motivations, the aspirations, and the intensity with which we do it. And so something like the Illusio in education field, for instance, people wouldn't do it if there wasn't rewards. So the Illusio here kind of the field of education is that, if you invest yourself into this field and do well, it means that you're more likely to have a good job in the future and maybe earn some more money. In that sense, it's kind of worth the candle of investing, I suppose. So it's not necessarily the art of deceiving yourself, but I think, the reason this doesn't really work as false consciousness as ideology is we can see that some of the things from our own perspective that other people invest themselves in, we might see as absurd or stupid. So what Bourdieu is kind of pointing out here is that The way that we live our lives is that we kind of do things in different sections, different fields. We don't just invest in a culture, we do different things. But also other people do different things, and we can see that, and sometimes we mightn't understand it or mightn't think the investment is worthwhile, and we'll often kind of, take the piss out of those people or denigrate them or whatever. And that is also a key way that people relate to each other, according to Bourdieu. So while, people think it might be absurd that I don't know, buy so many records or something like that, atheists think, religion is absurd. The rebellious school child rejects the benefits of school. In terms of youth culture, people that aren't part of a subculture like, say, punk or goth will ridicule it as being kind of stupid and childish or, bad fashion or whatever. But for the people actually invested in those practices, they have real meanings. It's actually very important to the very meanings of their lives. And so in my friends that I play cricket with, for instance, they think that something like the Illusio investing in sociology, for instance, is kind of ridiculous. So again, this is the way of thinking about what meaning is, the different things that we invest ourselves in, the way those things give us meaning, but also then the kind of distinctions that people have in terms of what they invest in or what they're allowed to invest in. And what kind of distinguishes those things relates to Bourdieu's three kind of most famous kind of concepts, habitus, field, and capitals. The habitus is this idea of that kind of accumulated being, that as we kind of move through life, we're exposed to things and we kind of fold them back into our existence, and they become our dispositions. And we develop this kind of array of dispositions to kind of perform ourselves in different parts of society. So for those of you who've kind of heard about Goffman, that performance of the self, in a way this is a way of thinking about that. We're not exactly the same people in all different circumstances of our life. We perform a slightly different version of ourselves, whether we're at work or whether we're our mates or whether we're in front of our parents. We kind of regulate our sense of self and what we say and do in relation to those social situations. So a habitus, in a sense, is a way of kind of thinking about, how and why we do that. And obviously people have different habitus, therefore, based on the way that they're socialized. So habitus, therefore, becomes a sense of self, but also a sense of what's normal. So, some people will develop a sense of normal in terms of, eating their dinner, in front of the television. Other people would have developed a sense of eating dinner, with 7 different forks at a big wooden table or whatever. Even though there's that same act of eating dinner, the sense of what's normal about that will be very different, and that kind of rolls into our habitus. What that means then is when we do something like eat dinner in a social situation that isn't normal to us, it'll feel uncomfortable, and we might know the meanings of the fancy forks or whatever, and we'll feel out of place. And habitus in that sense is a kind of emotional mechanism for trying to deal with what's in front of us. In some places we'll feel really comfortable, in other places we'll feel discomfort. This is what Bourdieu calls symbolic violence, that I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a minute. The notion of field is a kind of methodological concept in Bourdieu's work, and it's used to kind of limit the object of the thing that you're studying. So, Bourdieu did studies on the field of education, the field of politics and the state, photography as an art form, and the art world as a field in particular, cultural consumption, and lots of other kind of studies. And he had a whole research team as well doing all kinds of different studies. So it's important to remember that this field is a kind of a way of thinking about, we don't participate in all of the world at once. In some ways we don't, as individuals, don't participate in much of the world. But we're forced to participate in some things like, education systems and things like that. But not all of us, for instance, will participate in the art world. Again, the notion of habitus is a way of thinking about, who and why participates in some things and others, or in some kind of more forms of discrimination, who's not allowed to kind of participate in particular parts of society. So a kind of broad way of thinking about a field is through these kind of metaphors. A farm field, a military field, and a magnetic field. The farm field is like where specific things happen, so if you think about the education system as a field, the specific things that happen there are people come to these spaces to learn, different subjects, with the hope to, make themselves a better job candidate or whatever. But there's a whole bunch of policies involved in that field that, restrict what can and can't go on. These are kind of things in terms of limiting what happens in that kind of area. The military field, battle over kind of what goes on in the field. So For instance, you can see this throughout our Australian history about the education system, for instance, about the way that history should be taught. Some say we should make sure that we constantly teach history in a way that reminds the fact that Australia was kind of invaded by England and decimated the indigenous community. Others have argued that's like the black armband view of history. So again, you can see in those kind of struggles, there's struggles over what should be knowledge in that field or what should take place in that field. So it's kind of that battlefield. In terms of the magnetic stuff, when you enter the field, you're pushed and pulled by things that are beyond your control sometimes. I mean, thinking about, like, say someone from a disadvantaged background coming to university in the education field, they might live an hour away from the university where there's bad public transport. They might have to work a part-time job. Those kind of things fundamentally influence the way that people then have a trajectory in that field, how their kind of possibility of successes are kind of mitigated by those kind of other circumstances that are beyond their control. So habitus and field are kind of seen as a connection in many ways. What they aren't is a replacement for agency being habitus and structure being field, because they don't really work without each other. And so this is a way of thinking. Bourdieu is trying to break that kind of subject-object divide there. Probably the most used concept of Bourdieu is his notion of capitals, and particularly cultural capital. So he writes about social, economic, and symbolic and cultural capital. Social capital is essentially our connections to other people, where some people increasingly use this as a kind of notion of community, and people need to kind of just get more involved in it to kind of have a better life or whatever. Bourdieu talks about social capital as a form of exclusion, the way that networks work, the way that kind of, jobs for the boys and nepotism kind of things work, the way that people that are similar to each other tend to try and exclude people that aren't like them. Economic capital is very much like Marx's capital. It's the money that you have and the things that you own. And symbolic capital is the ability to kind of have influence beyond your own field. Like celebrities in particular is a good example, the way that they kind of have like all kinds of, privileges connected to their fame. Cultural capital, though, is a way of thinking about how inequalities aren't just about material and aren't about just who you know. They actually relate to kind of hierarchies within culture as well. So, cultural capital is tend to be kind of in three states, and state there needs to be thought of kind of, different, almost like water, like liquid, solid, and gas. There's the embodied, there's the objectified, and the institutionalized. The embodied capitals is the kind of way that we use language. Again, this is the one that's most heavily relied on our socialization. So it's kind of our language, our body language, the way the things that we have affinity with, and the ways that we're comfortable in different places or not. Again, here the notion of cultural capital means that those with lots of embodied cultural capital tend to be from relatively middle class, privileged, or rich backgrounds, because the things in the world that are kind of deemed, legitimate or cool or whatever reflect those people's tastes. The objectified forms of capital are things that you own, but they're not just kind of property. They're like things like when Bourdieu was kind of talking about affinity with art, is if you had artworks in your household, you were more likely then to have an affinity with art, more likely to go to museums. This would like have knock-on effects for educational successes. Today you could think about objectified cultural capitals as things like access to the latest technologies and things like that. The institutionalized forms of capital are your qualifications, basically. And you can see how the embodied, the objectified, have an influence on, what kind of institutionalized cultural capital you have. So, how successful you're going to be in education in particular. But also, institutionalized capital is a way of thinking about how there's actually hierarchies in qualifications. A degree at University of Newcastle isn't as high status as, say, from Harvard or Oxbridge or Cambridge. So these are kind of ways of thinking about the different hierarchies within culture, have profound effects on, the way that we have affinity with things, where we feel comfortable, and if we feel uncomfortable in spaces, we tend to try and avoid them. So trajectory is a way of thinking about how we're constantly on the move. Again, that kind of narrative of the self in a way in terms of the reflexive modernity theorists. And it's a way of kind of moving beyond the kind of false consciousness idea of people that are just kind of cultural dupes, stuck in one place. We're kind of constantly making decisions, moving through the world. So if you think about field, you're in the education, you're currently on a trajectory through it. And some will be moving quicker than others, largely based on your capitals, and that kind of thing, how much time you have, all that kind of stuff. So trajectory is also a way of thinking about, beyond the false consciousness model from Marx, about how people then act strategically within their class position. Their class position doesn't determine what they think and do. There's a range of options, and obviously, the more privilege you have, the more options you will have. But then within our own options, we can act strategically and try and kind of, move forward. So this is kind of a way of thinking about the strategies that we make in day-to-day life. And again, this relates back to the kind of unequal notion of choice relating back to risk, I suppose. Within each field, there's a kind of doxa. And a doxa is a way of thinking about what's taken for granted. It's like the rules of the field, common sense, norms, values. So, it's doxic when you come to university lectures, not to play your music really loudly while someone's talking, or that's doxic in the university system to kind of do assessments and choose subjects and this kind of stuff. This is kind of the stuff that almost goes without saying, that we don't question very much. But importantly, it's not just kind of scientific fact that those things are happening, and it's not natural. These kind of norms, these kind of things that we take for granted, are actually misrecognized, because they're not just kind of the best way of doing things or the natural way of doing things. They're actually the result of historical struggles over time that have happened, for centuries. So the university institution itself is a really good example of that, the way that it was kind of developed, centuries ago, and it's kind of in some ways has changed a hell of a lot, but still it hasn't changed in other ways as well. So misrecognition in this sense is kind of a way of thinking about temporality, a way that we're kind of born into the world at a particular time or place. We obviously can't be cognizant of kind of the history of everything, so we kind of enter into fields in relative good faith that what's going on in there is kind of is good and fair or whatever. But what we often then find out very quickly is the common sense norms and values tend to advantage some people over others, and largely this goes without saying. So again, in the kind of education, to continue using that as an example, the very things that you study in, say, literature are kind of chosen by academics who tend to be quite middle class and tend to have very specific tastes. And therefore, it advantages middle class people, because people from more disadvantaged backgrounds have to come and learn a different culture to succeed in that space. And this is the case through all the kind of, different disciplinary, different disciplines and science and things like that as well. So misrecognition shouldn't be thought about false consciousness, and doxa is not ideology. It's kind of a way of thinking about our kind of thrownness into the world, the way that we kind of, enter into like our narrative of the self in many ways, in a kind of show of good faith to the institutions around us. We need to kind of get on with life and make money and be able to be secure and that kind of thing. So we, play that social game that I'll talk about in a minute. But we often then experience the doxic norms of particular fields and the demands of us within those fields through the notion of symbolic violence. So again, here this is a kind of way of thinking about how inequality is as much an emotional experience as a kind of material one. So when you put all these kind of pieces together, these concepts together, we can think about then the way that we kind of behave in society, the way we accumulate our being, the way that we kind of pursue our interests in different fields, through what Bourdieu called social games. Now this is a metaphor, and you need to think about it with caution. It's not like, meant to be just the exact way of thinking about things. But, we enter into the field, say, of education knowing what the stakes are, in the sense that, if we do well, we'll have better qualifications and be able to maybe get a better job. So we then invest ourselves in that. We play the game. We try and learn the rules. And some of us will invest ourselves more into the game more intensely than others. That's not necessarily about personal character or anything like that. It's often got to do with other material things going on elsewhere that minimises the chances of actually legitimately intensely investing in something. So again, I'm using education as an example because it's one of the key fields that Bourdieu developed his theories, but also as a way of maybe relating to you guys as students in terms of your own experiences at the moment. Maybe you can think with some of these concepts reflexively about your own experiences in that sense. So the concept of symbolic violence is also, I think, a really useful way of thinking about things, and I'll be drawing upon it a lot throughout the course. To think about, what punks do and, what people in disadvantaged positions do and things like that. The symbolic violence is essentially an emotional experience of being devalued, denigrated, dominated in particular parts of your life, or feeling uncomfortable in spaces. It's like, so what you need here to say, go to an art gallery to, behave and practice correctly, you need to have some kind of sense of history over the history of art. You need to understand, the way things developed and, the difference between, surrealism and Dadaism or something like that. If you don't understand those things and you're in that space, well, you might feel out of place, or you might even feel that the whole thing's stupid. But nevertheless, you can't really practice legitimately in that field without that kind of knowledge. You will experience a form of symbolic violence, therefore you'll feel out of place, or you might be actually excluded by, by other people in that space. Importantly here, what it means is that many of the important fields in society are dominated by people with lots of money and lots of cultural capital, and therefore the norms in those spaces reflect their own lives. And this can actually happen kind of almost accidentally in a way, but in terms of, say, what dominates literature or whatever. But in other ways it's more pernicious, in the sense that people are kind of actually actively struggling to kind of put their own economic circumstances over others. So more people with more cultural capital will have more ability to kind of make the world in their own image, which relates to another concept that I won't go into, called conatus. People that have more capital, more time and space to invest themselves in things, have more of an opportunity to kind of influence the world in that sense, and therefore the norms become more like them. Symbolic violence is therefore experienced when you feel you're not in complete control of what's going on, or you don't have access to something, or you don't fully understand something in that sense. Importantly, when symbolic violence results and is kind of used in what Bourdieu calls distinction, and one of his famous quotes is this idea of taste classifies and it classifies the classifier. So when I was talking earlier on that people move through the world as symbolizers, this is a key way that we relate to each other. Bourdieu's sociology is mostly about social relations in that sense. And then what we do, if you see someone dressed in a particular way, you will classify them, as say a hipster or a bogan that we'll talk about later in the course. But the way that you classify that person classifies you, because different people will classify that person differently. One person's hipster could be another person's bogan. So distinction is the way that we kind of relate to other people. And importantly, it's kind of a way that we kind of have a sense of our own place. We tend, through process of what's called homophily, want to try and associate with other people that are more like us because it's more comfortable. And therefore we have a sense of our place of who we belong with and who we don't. Importantly, in things like education systems, what it means is people from disadvantaged backgrounds tend to treat those spaces, because they're dominated by other ways of being, as not for the likes of them. So there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy here that people from disadvantaged backgrounds tend to exclude themselves from these privileged spaces, or have a hard time getting ahead in them because they don't have the cultural capitals. And again, this is a key kind of thing that Bourdieu wants us to think about with how inequality works. So in that sense, there's kind of people make realistic decisions, I suppose, in their trajectory. And they kind of succumb to what Bourdieu calls amar fati, and be content with what one has. So the idea here is that people that from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds tend not to kind of, step out of their lane too much, and this in itself, in and of itself, reinforces inequalities. So Bourdieu's work's been profoundly influential, but it's also been really fruitfully developed by a whole bunch of more recent theorists, and particularly feminist theorists. There's a really amazing collection called Feminism After Bourdieu, and the papers, particularly by Skeggs and Lawler, McRobbie and Adkins, I think are really particularly useful for thinking about gender relations and emotions and affect. And I think throughout the rest of the course, these people's work will come up quite a lot as an influence in the particular case studies. So particularly in terms of cultural capital and the way people to relate to each other, it's not just about tastes and knowledge. It's also about morals and values. And you can see this all the time with the way that, people judge, the way other people might, feed their children, or, allow their kids to do something over, something that they deem risky or whatever. Again, the moral and values of society tend to reflect the middle classes, and therefore advantages them, and it puts people from more disadvantaged backgrounds in kind of denigrated, symbolically violent positions. So In particular, the work of Bev Skeggs and Steph Lawler are great to kind of check out to kind of get an understanding of those things. Relating it to the idea of reflexivity and touching back on, say, the work of Giddens here, who kind of talk about how class becomes less important in today's society. Again, as you can probably tell, I would question that. I mean, it's probably true in some respects in terms of people don't have class at the forefront of their identities. But reflexivity doesn't mean that class disappears. In fact, if people are reflexive, they can actually be reflexive about their own experiences of inequality. And again, that'll come up throughout the course as well. So for the kind of the playoff between like kind of the Giddens reflexive modernity stuff and the more kind of things that are people that are interested in class, have a look at the list of readings. There's a debate that happened in the pages of the Journal of Youth Studies that I was involved in with Dan Woodman and Steve Roberts and David Ferrugia and some others that kind of have been writing about, you know, what that means. So overall, you can probably tell, you know, as I can so easily talk on and on about Bourdieu so much, that I'm really enamoured by his work and find it fundamentally useful. I think he gives us really interesting ways to think about processes of socialisation and the way that we become who we are and the way that we see and feel in the world. But it's not deterministic like Marx, even though Bourdieu is often described as a deterministic. Importantly, he shows how humans create meaning and invest themselves in those things that they find important, but also highlights then how, you know, there's distinctions between how and why people invest in things and have access to different things. He particularly is important for highlighting how culture is really important in terms of inequality. The inequality isn't just about material economics and what you own. There's also kind of hierarchies built within cultures that are the product of kind of long social struggles, but become totally normal, almost seen as natural. But really, rather than being a social order, in inverted commas, they're actually the product of social struggles, which means that they can be changed if the struggles go in a different direction. So he shows here how the arbitrary in those struggles can be made to important hierarchical. So what I mean by that is that there's a kind of fundamental challenge here to the kind of notions of beauty and coolness and authenticity and taste in Bourdieu. The things that we consider, those things, could be others. So what I mean by that is that, for instance, the example I use all the time is like, say, cuts of meat. For some reason, the filet mignon, which is a small, tasteful version of meat, is seen as kind of a very high cultural, high status, good version of it with a T-bone. The big version with the bone in the middle is seen as kind of a low bogan version of it, right? But really what Bourdieu is saying here is that things like that just reflect the tastes of more powerful people over others. And as those tastes change, you know, different things could move up and down the kind of taste scale in that sense. An example of this is something like sushi, where, you know, a couple of decades ago, sushi was only really eaten by, say, people in Australia when they travelled overseas or in kind of exclusive restaurants. Now you can see tradies eating it for lunch. So things change over time, and this is where kind of social change can kind of happen that a lot of people don't seem to see in Bourdieu's work. So status comes to the fore in this. Taste, morals, values are really important in kind of creating hierarchies and also for kind of, you know, denigrating people, which keeps them in a place in the social space. Cultural capital is therefore a really important way of thinking about how and why people are successful in particular practices in fields over others, or even, you know, why people can participate in some fields over others. Through the notion of symbolic violence, Bourdieu can kind of show how people experience all kinds of social suffering. But it doesn't necessarily relate to not having money, it seems to relate to not having recognition. So again, we can use these to think a little bit about the kind of trajectories of ontological security that I was talking about in youth transitions. So as I've said, Bourdieu has been you know, hugely used, hugely influenced. People love Bourdieu. There's also other people that criticise him, say he's determinist. But Bourdieu himself pointed out that he doesn't really want his work to be used as like a set of sociological laws. He'd like to see people creatively engage with them and kind of, you know, update them or get rid of them as they're no longer necessary. So I think there's a lot of interesting work that kind of is doing that at the moment. And I'll be kind of trying to present some of that throughout the course. So I would say too that kind of, you know, there's much in Bourdieu's work that can kind of help us engage with notions of uncertainty and indeterminacy and fuzziness and all that kind of stuff. That he's not that deterministic in that sense, and that's particularly the case if you kind of consider those more overlooked concepts beyond habitus, field, and capital, and think about Illusio and social gravity and some of these other things. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks. Oh, no, I won't. Sorry, one more slide. So, as I said, Bourdieu has been really influential in youth studies, and you can see throughout this course, but throughout even say the Journal of Youth Studies, he's probably the most cited theorist, maybe with Beck, I suppose, I'm not sure, but probably Bourdieu. It's been particularly useful for showing how class works. So, despite all these changes that Beck and Giddens and the others talk about, Bourdieu has been used to kind of show the persistence of class inequalities in particular. So I'll be drawing upon these thinking tools throughout the course. You'll see that Bourdieu comes up particularly over the next 4 or 5 weeks where I present my own work, but it also is important for thinking about aspects of the labour theory that we'll be looking at later in the course as well. Thanks.